It's always a bit weird when we kick off these things to talk about ourselves after we've just been introduced so thoroughly. A little bit of it's a bit of the same, but I think part of what we wanted to talk about is how we came to do the work that we're doing and the impact that some of this work hopefully has on other people and the way that others are contributing to it, especially with this that's been built around the idea of survey. So I'm going to share the screen because we've got a bunch of slides, including some stuff. This is the first time that we've put any of our material that has come into the survey that we've had running for the last few weeks into a public setting. And so it's a really exciting opportunity to do that, but we'll talk a bit about what's involved with it. So sharing screen now and shucking it up to, thank you.
While Prof's just doing that, I'll just clarify. Like my bio that you had there is kind of my musicking bio, and I wear a few different hats. And so, yeah, one of the words in there, holobiont, is, you know, that's a bit of a remnant of having an ecologist parent. And yeah, thinking with the kind of interrelated ecological systems of the body, holobiont is just a word for organisms that are made up of more than like one lot of DNA. So we think of ourselves as like a human genome ourselves, but there's actually way more bacterial RNA in our bodies than there is human DNA. So that's kind of that we actually are kind of co-created ecosystems. And I think I'm going to link this back in. I'm not clarifying anything. Is that what you're going to say, Prof?
No, just a little bit scared, but I have maybe fallen behind in our scholarship.
No, it's the particular tangents that I've gone down in the past, but I am going to link this back in because I think you know, that's something I thought about a lot in my musicking practice, and like being co-constituted and really thinking of what that means, I guess, beyond just the like physical reality of that as being like a co-constituted organism that always is more than what we consciously kind of think of ourselves as. This kind of idea of subjectivity is always so complicated. And I think that actually is a really interesting link. I don't usually use the musician bio to do more academic stuff, but it actually makes me really think about the links with the work that I've been very lucky to do with Prof. Sandy O'Sullivan and this project, and thinking about kind of complex identification, and particularly in this instance, like queer identification and queer representation, and really like centering that from this point of Indigenous queerness, and seeing how that plays out on television in the rare instances that it does, but hopefully increasing. And then, you know, how that can shape how we read complex queer representations, and the kind of idea that even that, you know, writers might write a character to be this really particular thing, and it can be kind of in these like kind of rigid containers that Prof talks about quite a lot in terms of like these colonial constructions of what we're supposed to be fitting into and presenting ourselves as, that very much are particularly uncomfortable and or just like ill-fitting or just not at all sufficient, particularly for Indigenous people, that they were designed in a way to situate subjectivity somewhere else, you know, in other bodies. And yeah, but even when these characters are written in certain ways, that it also matters who's reading them. It also matters how audience is engaging with these complexities. And so in a way, the audience is co-constituting, is sort of co-writing these characters. And I think in this survey, that's one of the really exciting things. Well, we're going to rewind in a second and like kind of like, you know, give a bit more information there. But that was kind of a thought that came into my head that was bursting to come out, that this is one of the exciting things about this survey and doing this work, and is that we're really seeing how people participate in the co-creation of representations and seeing themselves or not, and how that can be done much better in many instances. So yeah.
And they opt out, you know. Sorry, I should say I'm joining you from Cubby Cubby Land right now. And they opt out of seeing themselves as co-creators or engagement when representation isn't there. And people can opt out and still expect more. And you can't know that by doing a literature-based review or approach to understanding material that's been developed. And so that's one of the reasons that we've gone to survey, which we'll go back to. But it was actually me who provided the music survey, the music bio of Han to the team here. And I did it absolutely intentionally, even though I had attempted to correct it with something else. Look, there's a reason why I'm working with Han, and it's because of their capacity to have very complex understandings of the way that gender and sexuality don't sit outside of the broader landscape of who we are, but they're part of this way that we make and constitute and reconstitute ourselves in the world. Now, as an Indigenous person, and I'm a Wiradjuri person, I spend a lot of time thinking about what this means for our community at large and our specific community, and then a lot of time thinking about some of the ways that colonialities have disrupted that. TV is really interesting in that space. So we'll rewind to talk about how we kind of got here, but also some of these findings that are remarkable. A lot of people who work in the gender studies area, but very specifically in the queer studies area, who don't go out to ask people things and don't go to survey. There's a lot of dismissal of that, and it's actually happened for some very complex reasons, but not the least of which is that the majority of people in queer studies and gender studies are doing that work in their research only in their PhDs and often don't extend it beyond that. So that's a reality. And as a result, we're often seeing that there are kind of containment of what's possible that's led by people who come ahead of them. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well, because I think it's a real problem. I don't know what people feel or think when they watch TV. I don't know how I would know that without asking people. So I think it's incredibly important for us to get that kind of feedback, but also it's everybody is joining us to build it. And people have been remarkable. We've had over 1,200 responses to this first survey without a lot of promotion, I have to say. And it's what people have shared is thousands of pages of material that might seem a little bit daunting if you work in this area as a researcher, but I can tell you it's also incredibly exciting. And people have shared experiences and ideas that we couldn't have fathomed. So yeah, we're doing this work, but it's not the only work. It's just one of the projects of a future fellowship that I was lucky to get through. I'll give a little bit of a background on who we are and where we are. We're in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie. We work in the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures, and in that space, which is also part of the department, we have these three areas. And you can, if you look at the three areas, and you can look at this online, of course, later, you'll see that we have sections of this that are about understanding who we are as Indigenous people and as allies working in a space of thinking about global futures. And one of those areas is the intimacies area. We're also in digital futures and in future world. This idea that Indigenous people are the only ones who can talk about our futures, but that we can co-create these ideas of where we're at the moment with our allies. We also
just before you jump away, I mean,
sure.
This is still linked, but I just want to say, yes, we both do work at Macquarie and we're not there. And I should say I'm also off campus on Yaguru, Yarrapul and Turrbal country in Mianjin, Brisbane. and both of us do come down and visit on Darug Noora at times, but sorry to not be there in person for this particular event, but also that the Indigenous Studies Department and the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures based there at Macquarie University is really one of the most remarkable places with an incredible group of people who are particularly thinking about queer theory and Indigenous theory in much more complex and like a complexity of reading the interrelations and the particularities of queer indigeneity. And it's an opportunity for anyone in and around in queer studies or queer thinking at Macquarie University to come and make contact with the Department of Indigenous Studies. And it's not like a place just for Indigenous people, but instead it's a way of really thinking about how everything that we do in this place, is situated on sovereign Indigenous land that has not been ceded, that will never be ceded, that has never been ceded, and that is subject to ongoing contention and struggle. Like there's nothing that we can do in this place, particularly as white settlers or as settlers of any background, that is not situated in relationship to this. And the more engaged that any students can be, and particularly when you're at this level of being like a research student, an early career researcher, with the actual place that you're in and the people to whom this place belongs, I think the better your scholarship will be, no matter what area you're looking at. And so, sorry, Prof, these subjects are kind of relevant to anyone who might be interested in them.
Oh, look, absolutely. And look, the third year unit is a reading unit. It's a unit that's about reading, broadly imagined, includes looking at TV, reading queer indigeneity. The second year one is much more of an introduction, but there is nowhere in the world that is doing undergraduate Indigenous Studies degree that is made up of 8 units, where 2 of the units are queer Indigenous units. And there's a reason for that. We're a centre in complexity. It's also why we're looking at TV and queer representation when we're focused on something that's really about Indigenous representation. We're broadening it out because complexity is complexity, right? And trying to understand that helps us as Indigenous people, but it helps non-Indigenous people to understand that Indigenous people want to have a place in that. So these are amazing units. I strongly urge you to get in touch. This is us. You've heard a little bit about us, so I won't spend a long time on that. Beyond institutional ethics, one of the things that we've brought to this project is the Yindamara Winangata, which is a Wiradjuri way of thinking put into language. That's this idea of respectfully knowing how to live well in a world worth living in. So the idea is making a better world. It's not just going, be really nice if, it's not just hoping for the best. It's really trying to engage and trying to think about what people need to be able to thrive. So it's about being in good relations, but it's about that notion of thriving. So at the center of a lot of this is the idea that areas like gender studies and queer studies belong in Indigenous studies. That's where they can be centered. And the reason that they're not centered there is typically because there's this sense that somehow we sit outside of the mainstream. But actually we're bringing quite a lot of complexity into this place. And so we make a very strong case that gender studies belongs in Indigenous studies departments, and queer studies, absolutely. So this is the project that I've been doing for the last couple of years with Han. And we've got a few other people that we're working with on this as well. Some really, remarkable junior scholars who are thinking through this space and who will be presenting on this at different times. And this project was funded by the Australian Research Council. They contributed a little over $1 million, and the university contributed just a little under $1 million to allow us to take time out and to do this project that will have multiple outcomes. That's really about understanding that people need to be able to see and engage complexity in order to live their lives. So art is really important. It's important, obviously, to Han and I. We've both been musicians for a very long time, and I've been an academic for over 30 years. I'm in my late 50s, and I'm very engaged in the idea of art in all of its forms being a window into ways that you can exist in the world. And TV is probably one of the most literal ones. I'm a little bit shocked to discover that young people now watch more TV than ever. I actually assumed that that wouldn't be the case, and the rhetoric from people is often that that's the case. So, but in fact, recent material that's come out of the strikes that they've had over in Turtle Island at the moment in the US has been very specifically focused on the idea that more people than ever. So, you know, they've been in their interest to kind of undertake some statistics on this. And that's been very helpful for us. So we've got a few projects here. We've got work that I've been doing for a really long time on this idea of understanding the colonial project of gender, and Han worked with me on that. And then work that we've been doing together that we're about to have a survey out on it that's looking at First Nations artists and the work that they develop in order to recognise that if we exist now as queer Indigenous people, we've existed in the past and we will exist in the future. So this notion of Indigenous survivance that Jared Visner talks about. And then this kind of protest, challenge, inquiry, affirmation work that we do in a lot of different ways. So we find lots of journeys to this, but a lot of it in spaces like social media, in public discussion. And then challenging symbolic annihilation, which was sufficiently difficult to understand that we said, let's call it Queer as a TV survey. So it's challenging that idea of not being visible, you know, so that idea, if you've ever looked at TV and felt like you weren't visible in that space, what it feels like, or that you're not as visible as you'd like to be in that space, then it's talking about the implications of that. And to do that, we really needed to find out what people thought.
And so we, yeah, sure. And so we did a lot of work like with a couple of amazing interns that we've had join us, Alana Blakers and Taya Miller, who both watched a lot of TV for us, which was really interesting because then we kind of had three generations represented. Prof's Gen X. I'm solidly like mid-range millennial, I guess slightly on the older side. I'm now 36, and then a couple of solid Gen Zs coming in and helping us see. They really helped us to open up perspectives and this kind of thing. And we went through and just watched as much TV basically as we could to just kind of get a sense of what the landscape was. And that kind of shaped the questions that we've then put into the survey. And so we might just, if you just want to sort of like slowly go through the next few slides, this is a pretty significant one when we're thinking about representation of Indigenous queerness. And it was a very short series, but it's kind of very dense in terms of all of the information that's packed into it. And I mean, I wish there was a lot more of it. It's also really nice to see something that's actually set in Brisbane.
Yeah. Look, I think it's 26 minutes in total. Like some of those episodes are 3.5 minutes. So, but it's amazing. Yeah,
you can watch that on ABC iView if you have not seen it. Highly recommended. And complexifies so many issues, and it kind of like really has a playful approach to ideas of cancel culture and how that can kind of play out in real people's lives. And yeah, of course, A League of Their Own, or A League of Our Own, sorry, is one of the most remarkable kind of like makings of a previous film. And what's particularly remarkable about it is it allows complexity of representation simply because of the number of queer characters. That there is just such a large group of queer characters, that you then start to have more complexity of gender, of like kind of gender expression and gender identity, then definitely also racial complexity with the addition of storylines about Max, who you see in the couple of photos here, who really interestingly is based on 3 real life people, that Black people who'd played in women who'd played on like men's baseball teams, and so
in the Negro Leagues.
In the Negro League, yeah. So yeah, which is also significantly not something that ever happened for white women. So there's a whole lot of complexities at play. Max also has a really interesting relationship with her gender throughout the course of the show, and grappling with having a relative who is transgender that she discovers, and didn't realize that this was the case previously, and the very fraught relationships within her family, and her own like coming to terms with that is a really beautiful storyline. I mean, I personally found it extremely moving. We also had the experience of one of our colleagues pointing out that even, there's a whole lot of different circumstances at play, but she saw herself in Max, seeing herself, being able to see like a queer, dark-skinned Black person with this kind of representation. And this was one of the things that really highlighted to us, even when the representation's not like a one-for-one, like exactly seeing yourself on screen, that there's possibilities once these kinds of complexities of representation are available on screen, that then are further complexified by audience engagement. So I don't know if you wanted to say anything further about that, Prof.
No, I think it's a really important point, though, is, this is a show that's set in 1943, so it's obviously not now. It's set in another country, and yet someone here could see themselves in this character. And I think that's what we do. We're capable of, well, actually, I think it's what we do. I know it's what people do because we've had feedback on the survey that said exactly that. And the people who are taking the survey, I mean, maybe a handful of them have heard us talk about this, but most haven't. This is their fresh take on this. And so we're getting, we might come back to Lovecraft Country if we need to. Because Lovecraft Country represents a real problem in representation. And also a wonderful opportunity. So
I guess just that kind of idea that not all representation is good representation as well. It's not a matter of just having more and more, but there's more to like how that representation is framed. That's really important.
Oh, well, since you've spoiled the punchline, let me pitch it out. So Lovecraft Country, if you didn't see it, lots of people did because we were binge watching everything in 2020, right? So it came out then. It was really a remarkable series that focuses on race in the middle of the 20th century in Turtle Island, in the area known as the United States, very specifically out of Chicago. And it's fantastical. It uses the notion of Lovecraft, who was notoriously a great big racist, as this sort of center point of the fantastical, but it tells real stories of what it was to be Black in the middle of the 20th century, which was also in many ways fantastical, though not fantastic. And so part of it is about talking about agency, but it's also about talking about restrictions. And it's got this wonderful, we know now that the thing that works the most, maybe not the only thing, but the thing that works the most is what Han was talking about right at the beginning. It's this idea that you can write a character, but if someone comes along and changes that through the very nature of their body and who they are, you're going to get something different and something new. And so the complexity of that is kind of what's joyful about these very large collaborative works like TV. But it can also be really narrowed because people can very much worry about how much that becomes uncontained. It's a product in the end that they're trying to sell. And so Lovecraft Country was really interesting because it's set up by the one thing that we know from this survey and from our guesswork and then the survey findings is that the the thing that works the best in terms of representation of complexity of identity is having people in the writer's room, having people who are making, having people who are performing these roles, but having people who are making decisions about it, who are invested in the idea of that complexity. So they are themselves, in the case of Lovecraft Country, Black. So Lovecraft Country is written by is written and conceived, and showrunner is a Black woman, and who pitched the importance of having all of these key critical race speeches that inspired the entire series. And in fact, they're literally there as a background dialogue to a lot of the events that you're watching. It's incredibly clever. It's wonderful until it's not. So, Han, should I chuck it over to you?
Sure. For those that haven't seen the show, this is an image here of Yahima. I think that's Yahima Marawakoti, who is played by Monique Candelaria, who describes herself as Mescalero Apache, Aztec, and European descent from New Mexico, while this character is presented as Arawakan, which is a complex kind of historical Indigenous identity that has modern day descendants that have different names for their identity at this point, their nations. This character is presented as kind of this holder of knowledge and of the language that then becomes like the basis of a very powerful magic that's mostly wielded by white men, that is being uncovered by the central Black characters in the show at this point. And the character of Yahima is being resurrected through this process, and is presented as someone who is two-spirit, from a very different era. That the kind of term two-spirit is not something that emerged until, or was coined until 1990, and it's one that's kind of, it's a term that's been used as an umbrella for queer Indigenous identities across Turtle Island, but
it wouldn't have been used in the 1950s. So it's immediately historically inaccurate, but there is another fundamental.
On top of that, the kind of idea of what it means to be two-spirit is kind of crammed into the body of this person, in that Yahima is represented as having a penis and breast, and the pronouns that are used get kind of complicated. It starts off being very much all she, her, and the person who's playing Yahima is not two-spirit, and neither is she specifically intersex. But she's a cisgender woman. However, she has used pronouns Z and Zia for her character in interviews, but that never appears in the show. And this kind of like presentation of this body is like quite gratuitous. There's nudity, and then there's a very short run of this character before she's murdered by one of the other characters. This kind of like the complexity of the presentation just becomes unbearable in the course of the show.
I will say, look, we don't use the H word in this, but it's the framing of it is this H word problem. So that, in other words, this isn't someone who's intersex. This is someone who's almost like a fan fiction version of an idea of mashup of gender that's not about gender at all. It's about the body. So it's completely wrong. Like everything about this character is wrong. And it's because it's not an embodied, there's no embodied realness to this. this is about the idea of a fantasy. And even the death is about a fantasy. It's like, oh, the grand tragedy of this, so that their only role is to be a dupe that gets, that gets built up to something and then gets taken down. So there's so many things wrong with it. Like the language is incredibly inappropriate. The reframing of bodies is just, and obviously what happened is the um, the showrunner didn't realize, like they didn't have anyone in the room who was Indigenous. They had the actor in the room. You're going to leave it to the person who's cast in the role and who, on correcting them, may lose their job to do that work. Also, who may not have the agency to be able to do that, comes in way after this is developed into the storyline, to do that work. They may not have known how they were going to be made up. This is, again, somebody who's a cisgender woman, who's playing this role. And this is pretty problematic in a whole lot of ways. And unsurprisingly, we started to hear about it in survey.
Mm-hmm.
So the question, and it started to inform, as Hans said before, the questions that we formed, because we knew that if we felt some of these things, other people would too. But we also didn't know if there was going to be more than that, because it's one thing to say that we were diverse in terms of our small group, but we're still a small group and we're not representing every kind of person. And so, or every person, so we wanted to hear actual feedback. And that meant doing a survey that has responses that are mostly in text form, which is kind of a huge thing. So, these were the kinds of questions that are there: harmful tropes, stereotypes, diversity. But we start with saying, have you seen something that's happened to you? You wish you could see this when you were younger? What would it have meant? Are you seeing shows? We've had a lot of people when they've done the survey, who's, I don't know if you have had, but I've had a lot of people who've said to me, oh, I couldn't think of shows while I was filling it in, and I only thought of them later. And I've had to say, yeah, it's not a test. You can look stuff up as well. But I totally understand that. And people have sent stuff to us afterwards and gone, oh, I forgot about these ones. We've got something at the end that kind of captures that as well, where we ask people if they can think of something else. And we've also added another question around fan art and fan fiction, which we didn't have in the initial 600. So again, we're not doing this to come up with numbers to say 50 people watched this show and 20 people watched this show and 50 people said this was doing. We're not doing it for numbers. We're really doing it to hear individual thoughts and ideas. There may be some trends that we can report on, but that's quite different than taking all of this and putting it into a quantitative analysis, which is, I think, again, it means that it's a lot more work, and there's a big disincentive to kind of not do that, because we happen to have a lot of time between us to be able to do this, but most people wouldn't have that.
Yeah, I guess that's the important thing, is that it's really really not centered around the industry, but centered around actually what is meaningful representation, what is meaningful complexity of representation, and how does that affect people who watch these shows. And so, it's maybe not information that like Netflix or whatever is going to find particularly useful, but it's maybe information that it speaks more broadly to how we create things and the stories that are told. And so, yeah, we really wanted to center, and we have actually rearranged the questions slightly. So this is no longer the last section, but by centering kind of the idea of queer Indigenous characters appearing, I mean, it's notable that there's a number of responses that are like, oh, I've never thought of this before, or oh, I've never seen anyone that's queer and Indigenous. I can't think of anything. Or even in the sort of questions that we have around, what kind of representation would you like to see of queer Indigenous characters? quite a lot of responses of being like, oh, it's not my place to say, but it's actually the fact that you haven't seen any representation and you can't think of anything, speaks to how and this is you in this kind of like speaking back to those particular respondents, but it speaks to how absent that is, that kind of symbolic annihilation that Prof was mentioning earlier, that suggests that this is not a category of human that exists, when of course we know it is, and of course we know that there's actually a like thriving communities. Yeah, I mean the evidence is literally right in front of you. Prof is a queer Indigenous person, and this that there are actually shows that have these characters, and kind of like bringing the attention back to that also brings the attention to like, what stories are we as like, a generalized art sphere, like what kind of stories are we telling, and why are those the things that kind of become part of like a dominant cultural narrative, like and something that we've talked about quite a lot is a kind of public imaginary. Like how does that actually shape the the horizon of possibility for all of us when so many people are watching copious amounts of TV and just can't even conceive of what a queer Indigenous character would look like. Yeah, so we're really interested in responses even when they give us these kinds of problems. And we do have the Queer As survey, which is the one we've been talking about today. Here's some helpful QR codes. So we invite everyone to take these surveys. They are not, there's no specific identity group that these surveys are targeted at. However, the second survey, which we haven't talked about today, but is thinking about art beyond just television, but thinking any kind of artistic engagement, and is specifically talking about queer Indigenous artists. It is open to everyone, but there'll be quite early on a separation between respondents who are Indigenous and who are not, just because we framed the questions slightly differently to really pay attention to those differences.
Yeah, it hits people differently, as you can imagine, and we want to really understand that a great deal with this. So we've got thousands of over 5,000 comments. That's not frightening at all, is it, Han?
I'm actually really excited. So
yeah.
I'm a big reader. It's fine.
Yeah. It's been amazing to read them. I put up the random ones here. You can see which these are questions. You can see what the questions are as you read this. But I'm not going to isolate any of these to talk about them, except to say that I was a bit surprised by some of our demographics as well. I haven't put up the demographics for you because we'll release that a little bit when we get towards the end of when we have it up. I suspect we'll probably hit 2,000. We'll start to do a bit more work on getting that out, but we're sort of focusing on the other survey at the moment, which is about to be released. We just Han just got it finished this morning. So what's important about the outcomes that we're starting to see here is that we're starting to see the complexity of those demographics being played out. So I was a little bit surprised that out of our 1,200, we had less than 200 men, people who identified themselves as men. So we had many more non-binary and agender people. We had a lot of other people who were, and a lot of women, of course. And so we had a lot of complexity in the people who were responding, which is great. What typically happens with a survey is that it starts to even out unless there's some other interruption that's occurred. For instance, if it's promoted by a particular organisation or a particular individual. Now, no surprise that we had a lot of non-binary people. Follow me on social media. I reckoned I would have expected that, but part of what happens is that's only going to account for a certain amount, and then we're going to start to have it be a much more evened out survey. I don't know what evened out means. It really just means that there'd be more of a lot of different groups of people, but probably we'll start to see, for instance, more men, or we may start to see more women, or we may start to see other kinds of representations for instance, of sexuality, we had, I think, quite a lot of people who were aspec, who came in and responded. Again, I think that's probably because of me, to some extent. I also think it's probably because of them. I think they're motivated by the fact that representation is pretty poor in those spaces. And so, so a lot of this is who gets motivated enough to write stuff. And people wrote a lot. You know, it was a lot. We've got a few single liners on there, but actually there were a lot of things that people were saying. Some people really genuinely wrote essays, which was amazing and really powerful. It's anonymized, and you know, we're really happy if somebody later on says, well, actually it was me that said that, and they want us to say they said it. We're quite happy with that as well. I think I think what a lot of people want is that they want to have an impact on what's happening in the making. How this works for that is really depends on a lot of factors, but we often focus on impact and effect. And one of the things that is important for us with that is ensuring that that those voices that aren't heard are heard on this. So if there's, you know, a particularly fantastic ace character, what makes it fantastic for that, for a group of people? They're all saying different things. So what makes that, you know, there be a kind of convergence on that character really working? We have it with, actually, I might just not do spoilers on some of that stuff, because there's one series that's pretty recent that has an asexual character in it that people might be in the midst of seeing the revelation. But one of the issues with asexuality is it's often a revelation.
I mean, I think so, there's just to plug an amazing book that both Prof and I have read, that I happen to have on my shelf. This book by Sharonda J. Brown, Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, which I think you know, it both like makes an incredibly powerful argument for the positioning of asexuality amongst the queer umbrella, but also it really shows the complexities of asexuality, and the fact that it's written by a Black asexual person really is one of the amazing, powerful things about it. But it really pulls apart questions of why sex is such a driving force. And I think we see on television so often like sex and sexuality, and by which I mean the act of sex rather than any particular idea of biology or something, is that kind of idea that sex sells sort of thing, but romance and sexual attraction drives so many narratives on television, and so in a way, like on the one hand, this is part of why queerness is so important, but it's also why asexual narratives are so important and so underrepresented, is because so much narrative is driven in this arc that's created around sexual attraction, romantic attraction. And so the kind of ace and arrow spectrum is extremely poorly represented. And we're starting to see some characters appear that have a bit more of the complexity. This is a mashup that I made to kind of like promote the survey. And I want to take ownership at this point that, you know, I was trying to represent a fair bit of diversity, but I didn't do a very good job of including either older queer characters or fat characters. And there's quite a few disabled characters on there, but there's still a lot more like visibility that could be part of that. And I think that's been raised by quite a few people in the surveys, that fat and disabled people, queer people, are not very often represented on television. And there's so many different ways of approaching and thinking these problems, and so much work still to be done. You know, a lot of those things come from my own positioning as you know, presenting as someone that's I'm actually not very able-bodied. So I'm you know, but I definitely am read when I'm well as able-bodied, and as definitely thin and presenting as white and all of these things as part of my identity, and the way that I'm read. And so I, neglected to see those things in this. And I think that also speaks to when those aren't the kind of central points of lived experience for people that are writing television stories and this kind of thing, that it's so easy to overlook some of these different stories. And so kind of complexifying who gets to tell the stories. And it's a big problem as we're thinking with those protests that are happening in America, the writers' protests in particular, like who's allowed in writers' rooms for how long, and to what degree they get to engage with some of these problems. When we're increasingly seeing the possibility of AI working within writers' rooms, or like people dropping in and dropping out and not having a lot of authority around things. The idea of having more complexity of representation within the space of creation, as well as just like the characters that end up on screen, that's really concerning. We're hoping that the survey that we have here, and as well as the survey that we have about queer Indigenous artists, can start to reveal some of the, real harm that lack of representation has on people in people's lives.
So what you get a sense of is that this isn't a list of shows. I mean, it is too, because I've actually got a list, but it's, and when people have listed shows, we've included it on the list, of course, but it's not that kind of an audit. And audits aren't always about this idea of visibility, meaning something able to be listed. It's also about how people are made visible or made invisible in spaces. And so we're looking at convergences. So looking at the way that sexuality or gender or both is represented, or queerness at large is represented, is really about having a deep dive. That's why we've called it that. It's actually about understanding the relationship between, for instance, shows. We watch, if you sit down and binge watch a show, chances are it's not the first time you've binge watched a show. You're going to do another one and another one and another one. They don't have any relationship to one another necessarily, but they do for you, because they become part of your broader lexicon of understanding. And that goes back to where Han started in talking about who you are in this space, and who we as bodies and co-creators are in making shows popular, but also calling them into question, also seeing their purpose, and being attached and committed to them as fans as well. So it buys into a lot of that, and it's very important for people. So we hope that it starts to give a little bit of a sense of both the presences and the absences, going back to the function of this whole conference. What does it mean if we're present in these spaces, and what does it mean when intentionally we're absent, or worse, unintentionally? So I think we'll finish on that and just ask if there's any questions or thoughts or concerns.
Can we just get a hand for both of our presenters?
That is a hilarious
hand. You've got the room there in front of you.
Hey.
We have some questions on the slide.
So we do have a couple of questions, also just a couple of comments. We'll start with the first comment, which was simply loving this commentary on going out there and talking to people. There's so much energy and excitement for this survey. Also, once we've finished up here, I'm sure that there are people in the room that would love to participate. So if maybe Han could share those QR codes with us. We've got them.
Already did it.
So our first official question here from Jessica McKenzie. Thank you, Han, Reardon-Smith, and Sandy. Fascinating work. You referenced the power, genuineness, and believability of representation when TV shows have writers in the room. who can write their identities and experiences into text, as in Lovecraft country. Did your survey participants have much of an awareness of this? How tuned in do you feel they were to problematic representations, or were participants more happy to just be seeing representation, even if it has its issues?
I think probably more of the second. There definitely was a very deep thought. We kind of got a sense that this would be the case, but I don't think I expected it to be almost exactly the same as the experience that we shared, which was worry about watching a show because it might have terrible representation was one of the things. So going, I'm really concerned that this is going to be negative representation and cringing and being worried about what happens the next day after a show is aired. You know, all of that kind of concern was absolutely there. The awareness of the importance of people participating in that, yeah, it wasn't there as much, but it's there. You know, so there were some people who articulated that, and I think their awareness, from what I read so far, and maybe this is also some guesswork, I'm not sure, is based on what showrunners have said on social media. So I know that with a league of their own, they've been very vocal about this. In fact, they've been vocal as they challenge and are part of the writers' strike. Part of the writers' strike and are challenging studios and the kind of idea of having multiple writers in the room, which is one of the sticking points for the strike, and arguing that the problem is that who gets kicked off is the most marginalized when you start to have a reduced writing room, and how do you change that? I mean, I'd say actually you challenge it, but also that's not an automatic. You know, so I'd say going back to the gender studies should be in Indigenous studies. That's my answer to it, you know. But in terms of what people were saying, yeah, there was an awareness. I think what's surprising to me is that this is so like the museum's work that I've been doing for the last 15 years, which is work that's on representation of Indigenous people in museums. And in that same way, the findings out of that have been really clear that this is about, like, that it's much better representation when there's Indigenous people who are making. Like, it's no big surprise that this is the case. But I think because of that, there's much more of an awareness, but people have said different things about how. One thing that we did have as a quote, but lots of people said it, is there's a real concern with cisgender people playing trans characters. And I think Disclosure, the movie, probably assisted with that discussion as well. Also people's feelings, but also people were saying that about sexuality as well, which was interesting.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Susan Barnes. So I saw one comment that said a show had a queer feel without having any explicit queer characters. Did your work extend beyond characters to other aspects of queer culture? Do you think it's possible to have a queer show without queer characters?
Yeah,
I'm gonna jump in on this one, Travis. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we've really thought about quite a lot. And one show that we've discussed a lot between the two of us, and also heard a bunch of other discussions, and I've seen a lot of discussions online, is Reservation Dogs. And the interesting thing about that show is that there's a lot of queer people in the writers' room, as showrunners, like in the production team and the direction team, and as actors on that show. And yet queerness is never explicitly named in that particular way, but there are so many clues throughout it. Or yeah, no, that's not.
It is once.
It is once. It is once.
Or twice actually. But yes. But it's not in an ongoing way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not kind of framed around that in the same way as we're used to seeing in some of the like inclusive shows, such as like Heartbreak High, or Sex Education in particular, where it's and others that really have this kind of, I mean, something we talked a lot about in the discussions with the two interns was this kind of like the woke high school kind of like phenomenon in recent things. And I think there's a lot that can be said about that, and both in like kind of creations of something that might be a queer utopia, and also you know, in trying to maybe change culture in some ways, but also kind of feeling like a bit of a denial of reality. It's a complex sort of phenomena, I think. But the particular thing with like reservation dogs, just it really centers indigeneity and Indigenous and Native American identity in that particular place.
And relationships.
All of the crew, yeah, totally, and relationships.
It's about
ways
relationships,
of living and being.
and what's fascinating about it is I don't think there's any. Well, okay, like at the beginning of season 2, there's a little bit of sexuality with the aunties, but there's not a lot of sexuality.
It's more in the aunties than
the kids.
Yeah, not in the kids. Yeah,
it's not with the kids. They're not kissing one another. So it's really interesting, because this is also the problem with representations of aceness. Like, you have to literally tell the audience that someone's ace, right? The demonstration of sexuality or gender is required. The reason what we're doing TV rather than film is the long form. You have a lot of time with characters. You have time for them to play this out, to maybe, like, one thing that we found with asexuality is that a lot of times characters are told they're ace by another character. So it operates as a way to explain to an audience what asexuality is if they don't know it. But also, it's kind of this idea that ace people are very aware. So it's that really kind of both problematic and really interesting, and really truthful and really untruthful. You know? So it's doing a lot of work, but it's a functionally problematic space to kind of assume that you have to tell people. So we had observed an interview where an actor who is playing a character who is both Black and Native said, well, I thought of my character as as queer. So they're Indigenous and Black, and that complexity was being discussed, but they said, oh, yeah, I just think my character's queer. Now, there's no reason to know that, because they're in the middle of a war and they're not doing anything that demonstrates their queerness, but the actor thinks it. And so they brought that to the role, whatever that is. But is it described? No. You know, is it ascribed by the writer's room? No. You know, but is it there in the interpretation? Yeah. So does that make them queer? Does that make us observing something that's queer and observable? And a million years ago, well, not a million years ago, but 20 years ago, I did some research on queer visibility, whether you could tell by seeing somebody on stage if they were queer, you know. And actually, what's really interesting is that notion of visibility, that notion of optics, all of the ways that they're sort of problematic terms, I realize, because they're using privileging ideas of the visual, but TV uses that. You know, it uses it so primarily as this idea of, you can just tell by looking, and you can just, you know, that it's really weird that it kind of does a lot of work to try and explain gender and sexuality, and Res Dog doesn't. And yet there are things that there are characters in it who definitely posit queer. But I counter that against the fact that a lot of white queer people made Indigenous people queer by dint of being Indigenous. It's deeply problematic reframing that was very common 10, 15, 20 years ago in the emerging queer studies. And so we're not arguing that at all. We're not arguing difference equates queerness. Yeah.
And furthermore, like, not only like ascribing all Indigenous people queer, but then like claiming them as part of that kind of community, and that once again reiterating the like this kind of like move to ownership by settler folk. And I think so that is something to be cautious about in the kind of like framing of a show like Reservation Dogs as distinctly queer, is to not like claim it by white queers in particular, but to really like read it in the complexity as it is presented. So yeah.
Thanks. We have one final question. That'll be our last question for today, from Emma Jackson. Thank you for presenting this important work and sharing a preview of what is still to come. I was wondering whether you were planning to look at whether participants' responses to representations were different or similar, depending on whether recent media is set now, such as All My Friends Are Racist or Heartbreak High, versus then, like A League of Our Own or Lovecraft Country.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In fact, what's interesting about it is like A League of Their Own has 15 queer characters that are that have lines, you know. So it's a lot for 1943, and yet it's believable. Similarly, the queerness, and there's a lot of it in Lovecraft Country. Yeah, it makes all the sense in the world. And so in some ways, there was definitely some romanticized, this is in terms of the responses in the survey, there were definitely some ways that people had talked about historical figures, or even those spaces that seem like the history, like Willow, but you know, they're like otherworldly. But also our flag means death, you know. So this whole notion of the past is simplified, but also more homophobic or more problematic, or not, because it can sit outside of that because it's kind of fantastical, is something that we're probably getting enough feedback to be able to comment on it. But Emma, I hadn't thought about it before until you said that. So I'm really grateful that you have. Yes is the answer now that you've said it. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of these things that when you start to bring them together and you put them out into a space where you line them up separate to just one person writing a whole lot of responses, you start to see patterns. And it's powerful to see it. So it's not just individual things that people have written, it's the way that they start to write things together. So I think we'll see that, especially now that you've raised it, as well as a lot of other things that we're not sure of at this stage. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing, just with A League of Their Own, having so many queer characters, I mean, it does make sense also because of the way that it is really like the particular stories that it is focused on. But it also, I think, you know, it is also a kind of documentation, like weirdly, because of course it is fiction, because there are threads of real life people that I think have been written in of you know, this kind of, sorry, I'm going to jump around a little bit, this kind of concept, or the thing that you hear more recently, particularly from more conservative press and things like this, that like, why is everything queer all of a sudden? Why is everyone queer? Like all young people are queer all of a sudden, like going to hell in a handbasket or something ridiculous. When in fact, like, you know, queer folks have always been here, and it's just like maybe circumstances are changing that mean there's some more safety to come together in community, there's some more acceptance, very slowly chipping away at some things. Certainly not in this kind of linear, like liberal narrative fashion of like, we're now allowed to be queer and we weren't allowed before. Like obviously there's some rights that weren't available, for instance, earlier in the 20th century, but that's very different from saying that no one was queer in the like 1700s, when we know that's like absurdly untrue. And you know, it also speaks to the kind of evidence, it's a very different kind of thing, but the evidence of that is like embraced in the word survivance that Prof raised earlier with Visioner's work, where this kind of you know, affirmation, which is another thing that Prof talks about quite a lot, rather than sort of ideas of transition or like this kind of progress narrative, but like this process of affirmation that if there are queer people now, if there are queer Indigenous people now, there have always been queer Indigenous people. And the language has definitely changed, and the kind of presentation and representation we see on screen has changed. But queer people have always been here, or like everywhere, and you know, have found ways of surviving in the circumstances that they're facing. And
our
so,
survey,
yeah,
our survey shows that too.
Yeah.
In the sense that we've got older people, like lots of older people. In fact, we were a bit worried we didn't have enough younger people at one stage. Older people like to have a little bit of a say. So
Yeah.
But we did.
We
you
still
know,
don't
we've-
have
we've
anyone
got-
over 85. So if you know anyone, that, like we've got quite we've got a couple in the like 60 to 85. But yeah.
Yeah, and we don't want we want people who are not queer as well as queer, of course. You know, everybody benefits from complexity of identity. Maybe not like queer phobes, but everyone else. They benefit from it as well. But yeah. Bless.
Bless.
The end.
Bless their hearts.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. We'll have one more round
you're
of
welcome.
applause from the room.
Thanks.
All right, so that is the end of our official proceedings today. Thank you, Sandy and Han,